Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. SSN filtered through the windows of the Victorian Mansion. Robert stood in front of the full-length mirror, his hands trembling as he adjusted the frilly collar of his maid's uniform. The reflection staring back at him was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the carefree backpacker who had arrived in Katarinaborg just days ago, replaced by a demure figure in a black dress with white trim. "You look lovely, dear," Greta's voice chirped from behind him. "Madam will be so pleased." Robert felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He turned to face the blonde maid, forcing a weak smile. "Thank you, Greta. I'm still getting used to all of this." Greta's blue eyes twinkled with amusement. "Oh, you'll adapt quickly enough. We all do." She glanced at the ornate clock on the mantel. "Now hurry along. It's almost time for evening tea. Madam doesn't like to be kept waiting." With a deep breath, Robert smoothed down his skirt and followed Greta out of the room. His Mary Jane shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as they made their way to the grand staircase. Each step was a reminder of his new reality, a houseboy in feminine attire, serving at the whims of the enigmatic Frau Kirchen. As they descended, Robert couldn't help but marvel at the opulence surrounding him. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their facets catching the dying sunlight and scattering rainbows across the walls. Priceless artworks and antiques adorned every surface, testament to Frau Kirchen's wealth and refined tastes. They entered the drawing room, where Frau Kirchen reclined on a chaise lounge, a book held delicately in her manicured hands. She looked up as they entered, her piercing gaze immediately settling on Robert. "Ah, there you are," she purred, setting aside her book. "Come closer. Let me see how you look." Robert approached, his heart pounding in his chest. He stopped a few feet away from Frau Kirchen and attempted a clumsy curtsy, nearly losing his balance in the process. A small smirk played at the corners of Frau Kirchen's blood-red lips. "We'll need to work on that, won't we? But the uniform suits you well. You have a certain delicacy about you that I find quite charming." "Thank you, madam," Robert murmured, keeping his eyes lowered as he'd been instructed. "Greta, pour the tea," Frau Kirchen commanded. "And Robert, do sit down. We have much to discuss regarding your duties here." Robert perched tentatively on the edge of an ornate armchair, his posture rigid and uncomfortable. Greta busied herself with the tea service, the gentle clink of fine china filling the silence. "Now then," Frau Kirchen began, accepting a steaming cup from Greta. "I'm sure you're wondering about the unique nature of your position here. Let me assure you, there's nothing untoward about it. I simply prefer my household staff to present a certain aesthetic." Robert nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He accepted his own cup of tea with shaking hands, nearly spilling it as he took a sip. "Your primary duties will involve light housekeeping, assisting Greta with meal preparation, and attending to any personal tasks I may require," Frau Kirchen continued. "You'll also be expected to maintain the gardens and grounds, though of course you'll have a different uniform for outdoor work." "Yes, madam," Robert replied softly, his mind reeling at the thought of more costume changes. Frau Kirchen's eyes narrowed slightly. "I do hope you're not having second thoughts, Robert. The salary we agreed upon is quite generous, after all, and I'm sure a young man like yourself could find many uses for such funds." Robert's thoughts immediately jumped to his dreams of gender reassignment surgery. The money he'd earn here could make that a reality far sooner than he'd ever imagined. He straightened his spine, meeting Frau Kirchen's gaze with newfound determination. "No second thoughts, madam. I'm grateful for the opportunity." A pleased smile spread across Frau Kirchen's face. "Excellent. I think you'll find that your time here can be quite transformative if you approach it with the right attitude." As the evening wore on, Robert found himself falling into a routine. He assisted Greta in clearing away the tea things, learning the proper way to handle the delicate china and silver. The weight of his skirts and the constriction of his corset became less noticeable as he focused on his tasks. Later, as the clock struck 9, Greta appeared to escort him to his room. "Time for bed," she announced cheerfully. "Madame is very strict about the household schedule." Robert followed her up the back stairs to the servants' quarters, his muscles aching from the unfamiliar work and constrictive clothing. Greta showed him to a small but comfortable room, sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk. "Your night things are laid out on the bed," Greta informed him. "I'll wake you at 6 sharp tomorrow morning. Sleep well." With that, she was gone, leaving Robert alone to contemplate his new circumstances. He approached the bed warily, eyeing the folded garments with trepidation. The satin pajamas Frau Kirchen had mentioned gleamed in the dim lamplight, their pale pink color a stark contrast to his usual sleepwear. Robert sighed heavily, beginning the arduous process of removing his maid's uniform. As he slipped into the cool satin pajamas, he couldn't help but marvel at how soft they felt against his skin. It was pleasant in a way he hadn't expected. Crawling into bed, Robert stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. How had he ended up here in this strange house with its even stranger mistress? Was the promise of money really worth the humiliation and discomfort? But as he thought about his aunts back home, with their suffocating concern and constant reminders of his parents' absence, Robert felt a twinge of rebellion. This was his choice, his adventure. And if it led him closer to becoming his true self, then perhaps it was worth it after all. With that thought, he drifted off into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of corsets and curtsy lessons. The next morning arrived all too soon, heralded by Greta's cheerful voice and a gentle shake of his shoulder. Robert blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by his unfamiliar surroundings. "Rise and shine," Greta chirped, throwing open the curtains to let in the early morning light. "Lots to do today," Robert groaned softly, sitting up and running a hand through his tousled hair. "What time is it?" 6 o'clock, just as I promised," Greta replied, bustling about the room. She laid out a fresh uniform on the bed, this one slightly different from yesterday's. "This is your morning dress. You'll change into your work uniform after breakfast." Robert nodded sleepily, climbing out of bed and stretching. The satin pajamas clung to his body in a way that made him acutely aware of every curve and angle. He flushed, suddenly self-conscious under Greta's appraising gaze. "Don't be shy," she said kindly. "We're all in the same boat here. Now, hurry up and get dressed. Breakfast is at 6:30 sharp, and you'll need to help me serve, madam." With that, she whisked out of the room, leaving Robert to navigate the complexities of his new wardrobe. The morning dress was simpler than yesterday's uniform, a plain black frock with a white apron. Still, it took him several minutes to fasten all the buttons and adjust the fit. By the time he made it downstairs to the kitchen, Greta was already busy preparing a tray for Frau Kirchen's breakfast. She looked up as he entered, giving him a quick once-over. "Not bad," she said approvingly. "You're a quick study. Now, watch carefully. Madame likes her breakfast served just so." Robert observed as Greta arranged delicate porcelain dishes on a silver tray. A soft-boiled egg in a gilded cup, thin slices of smoked salmon artfully fanned out on a small plate, a selection of fresh berries, and a steaming pot of coffee. "You'll carry the tray," Greta instructed. "I'll open doors and announce us. Remember to curtsy when you enter the room, and don't speak unless spoken to." Robert's stomach churned with nervousness as they made their way up the grand staircase to Frau Kirchen's private chambers. Greta knocked softly on an ornate double door, then opened it at the sound of Frau Kirchen's voice. "Good morning, madame," Greta said cheerfully as they entered. "We've brought your breakfast." Robert followed, carefully balancing the heavy tray. He managed a wobbly curtsy, nearly upsetting the coffee pot in the process. Frau Kirchen sat up in her massive 4-poster bed, silk sheets pooled around her waist. Her dark hair was perfectly coiffed, her face impeccably made up despite the early hour. She regarded Robert with an amused smirk. "Good morning, Robert," she purred. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, madam, thank you," Robert replied softly, keeping his eyes lowered as he approached the bed with the tray. "Excellent. You may set the tray here." She patted the bed beside her. "And then you and Greta may go see to your own breakfast. I'll ring when I'm ready to be dressed." Robert carefully placed the tray where indicated, then retreated from the room with another awkward curtsy. Once in the hallway, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Greta giggled softly. "You did well for your first time. It gets easier, I promise." Back in the kitchen, they quickly ate their own simple breakfast of porridge and fruit. As they cleaned up, Greta explained the day's schedule. "After we dress, madame, you'll change into your work uniform. There's weeding to be done in the rose garden this morning. After lunch, you'll help me with the laundry, and then it's time for afternoon tea." "Evenings are usually quiet, but madame may require our assistance with her correspondence or other tasks." Robert's head spun with the list of duties. It was a far cry from the carefree backpacking he'd envisioned for his summer. But as he changed into the promised work uniform, a pair of sturdy trousers and a loose-fitting shirt, both in a soft lavender color, he couldn't help but feel a small thrill of excitement. This was an adventure, after all. Not the one he'd planned, but an adventure nonetheless. And with each passing hour, the promise of financial freedom and the possibility of finally becoming his true self grew more tangible. As he stepped out into the sunlit gardens, pruning shears in hand, Robert took a deep breath of the fragrant air. The rose bushes stretched out before him, a sea of vibrant colors waiting to be tamed. It was hard work, but there was a certain satisfaction in it. By lunchtime, his hands were dirty and his back ached, but the neat rows of pruned roses stood as testament to his efforts. The afternoon passed in a flurry of starched linens and steaming irons as he assisted Greta with the laundry. She chatted amiably as they worked, sharing gossip about the town and tidbits about Frau Kirchen's eccentric habits. "She's not as harsh as she seems, you know," Greta confided as they folded a mountain of crisp white sheets. "Strict, yes, but fair, and generous in her own way. Did you know she paid for my sister's university tuition?" Robert raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Really? That's unexpected." Greta nodded, a fond smile playing on her lips. "Madam has her reasons for everything she does, even if we don't always understand them." As the days turned into weeks, Robert found himself settling into the rhythm of life at the mansion. The early mornings and strict schedules became second nature, as did the constant costume changes. He even began to take a certain pride in perfecting his curtsy and mastering the intricacies of formal table service. But it wasn't all work. In the quiet evenings, after Frau Kirchen had retired to her study, Robert often found himself in the mansion's vast library. Row upon row of leather-bound volumes beckoned, filled with knowledge from every corner of the globe. He devoured books on art, history, and philosophy, expanding his mind in ways he'd never imagined. One evening, as he was deeply engrossed in a tome on Renaissance art, a voice startled him from his reverie. "Ah, I see you've discovered Vasari," Frau Kirchen said, her voice rich with approval. "An excellent choice." Robert scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping the book in his haste to curtsy. "Madam, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Frau Kirchen waved away his apologies with a graceful hand. "Nonsense. I'm pleased to see you taking advantage of the library. Knowledge, after all, is the greatest treasure one can possess." She glided into the room, her silk robe rustling softly as she moved. Selecting a book from a nearby shelf, she settled into a plush armchair. "Tell me, Robert," she said, fixing him with her penetrating gaze. "What do you think of Vasari's perspective on the role of the artist in society?" And so began a series of evening discussions that would change the course of Robert's summer. Night after night, he found himself engaged in intellectual discourse with Frau Kirchen, debating everything from classical philosophy to modern politics. As the weeks wore on, Robert began to see Frau Kirchen in a new light. Behind her stern exterior lay a brilliant mind and a dry wit that often left him struggling to keep up. She challenged him, pushed him to think beyond the boundaries of his previous education. One evening, as they sat discussing the merits of various translation techniques, Frau Kirchen fixed Robert with a contemplative look. "You've come a long way since you arrived, my dear," she said softly. "I wonder, have you given any thought to what you'll do when your time here is up?" Robert blinked, surprised by the question. In truth, he'd been so caught up in the daily routine of the mansion that he'd scarcely thought beyond it. I'm not sure," he admitted. "I suppose I'll return to university in the fall." Frau Kirchen nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And what will you study?" Robert hesitated. Before coming to Katharinaborg, he'd been on track for a business degree, a safe, practical choice that his aunts had heartily approved of. But now, "I think," he said slowly, "I might like to study art history, or perhaps literature." Frau Kirchen's smile widened. "Excellent choices. Both fields that require a keen eye for detail and a willingness to look beyond the surface. Skills you've honed quite well during your time here, I'd say." Robert felt a warm glow of pride at her words. It was true, his experiences in the mansion had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the summer drew to a close, Robert found himself facing his impending departure with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was eager to return to the world beyond the mansion's gates, to apply his newfound knowledge and confidence to his studies. On the other, he'd grown fond of the quiet routines and intellectual stimulation of life with Frau Kirchen. On his last evening, as he carefully packed away his various uniforms, there was a soft knock at his door. Greta entered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, Robert," she sniffed, pulling him into a tight hug. "We're going to miss you so much." Robert returned the embrace, surprised by the depth of his own emotions. "I'll miss you too, Greta. All of you." She pulled back, wiping her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. "Madam wants to see you in her study. Best not keep her waiting." With a mix of anticipation and trepidation, Robert made his way to Frau Kirchen's private sanctuary. He knocked softly, entering at her bidding. Frau Kirchen sat behind her massive oak desk, a stack of papers before her. She looked up as he entered, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Robert," she began, her voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I want you to know how pleased I've been with your service this summer. You've exceeded my expectations in every way." "Thank you, madam," Robert replied, feeling a blush creep up his cheeks. She pushed an envelope across the desk towards him. "Your final payment, as agreed, but I'd like to offer you something more, if you're amenable." Robert leaned forward, curiosity piqued. "I have connections at several prestigious universities," Frau Kirchen continued, "including some excellent programs in art history and literature. If you're interested, I'd be happy to write you a letter of recommendation. Your experiences here, unconventional as they may have been, have prepared you well for advanced study in these fields." Robert's heart leapt at her words. A recommendation from someone of Frau Kirchen's standing could open doors he'd never dreamed possible. "That would be incredible," he breathed. "Thank you, madam." Frau Kirchen's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Don't thank me yet. My recommendations come with certain conditions. Should you accept, I'd expect you to return here during your school breaks, to continue your education." Robert's mind raced with the implications. More time in the mansion, more intellectual discourse, more opportunities to learn and grow. And yes, more time in corsets and petticoats. But somehow the thought didn't fill him with dread as it once might have. "I accept," he said firmly, meeting Frau Kirchen's gaze with newfound confidence. She nodded, a pleased smile spreading across her face. "Excellent. I look forward to seeing how you'll blossom in the years to come, my dear." As Robert left the study, his steps light with excitement for the future, he realized that his summer adventure had been transformative in ways he'd never anticipated. He'd come seeking funds for a physical transformation, but he'd found something far more valuable: the courage to embrace all facets of himself, both masculine and feminine, and the wisdom to see beyond surface appearances to the complex realities beneath. With a smile, he headed to his room to finish packing. The world beyond the mansion gates awaited, full of new challenges and opportunities. But he knew that a part of him would always belong here, in this place of mystery and revelation, and he couldn't wait to see what the future held. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.